Our next speaker is Mandy Brown Belfort, who is a physician and has an MPH. She's a neonatologist, a researcher at Harvard. She takes care of sick newborns, and she does her research in epidemiology on growth and nutrition and breastfeeding and neurodevelopment, and has worked with investigators not only here in the United States, but in Europe and Australia. She is extremely well published, and one of her publications is in your handout, your spiral notebook, which you'll want to look at. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Belfort. And you know what to do with that.
Figure it out. Great. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today and share some of our work. As Dr. Lawrence mentioned, I spend most of my time in the hospital and in a research lab, so it's been really inspiring to hear from our speakers earlier in the day who are actually taking some of our data and data from other sources and actually putting it into action. So thank you for giving me a chance to see where our data goes beyond the walls of our hospitals and research labs. Okay, so I'm going to give a bit more of a science than a policy talk, but hopefully with some pretty clear implications for policy and for the work that everyone is doing here. In addition to my clinical work and research, I also teach the Harvard medical students clinical epidemiology and population health. And so I'm going to weave just a little bit of methods in here for you guys, because I think it's really important for people who are using data to understand where it comes from and to understand how to be critical consumers of the medical literature. So I hope I won't bore you with some of the methods side of things, but I think it would be, it hopefully will complement some of what you've been hearing from other speakers. And I know we got behind schedule. Just tell me, like, maybe 20 minutes and then leave a little time for questions. Is that good? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start by providing some context for the questions that we've approached about breastfeeding and human milk and infant brain development, both from an evolutionary perspective and then also from a modern perspective, because that kind of cave woman analogy only goes so far in 2017. So just to kind of bring some of the evolutionary context into a more modern perspective, I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why we think breastfeeding, and in particular human milk, impacts infant brain development. How could that work? What are the mechanisms? Why might that be? And then bring in some data from our studies as well as from some other investigators, not just if breastfeeding impacts infant brain development, but also by how much, to what extent. There are many, many influences on infant brain development. This is one of them. How big a role is this playing? And then finally, just some concluding thoughts and hopefully motivations for a lot of the advocacy work that you do. Okay, so I think we all know it's a defining characteristic of mammals. All mammals feed their offspring milk. Milk itself is a very complex fluid. We don't really think about it in that way, but actually it's not just complex, but it's very, very species specific. So goat milk is very different from cow milk, is very different from platypus milk, is very different from human milk. So these milks are all designed optimally by evolutionary forces to meet the specific needs of the young in that particular species. And the process of nursing one's young has adaptive functions, and in particular, it's really the major mechanism by which mothers transfer resources to their young, right? So there are a lot of different resources that we can transfer to our young. We can transfer nutrients to our young. That's sort of the most obvious one. I'm sure you're familiar with many of the immune benefits that are present in human milk, and in the process of breastfeeding, mothers transfer immune resources to their young. There are trophic or developmental factors in milk. So milk is actually helping the infant develop their GI tract. And it's kind of an interesting, I think that this is just an interesting way to look at it. The mammary gland assumes many of the same functions that the placenta had played during pregnancy, functions of nutrition, functions of immune protection, functions of, in particular, GI development. And that theme will come up again when I talk about preterm babies. And something that I think actually receives very little attention in relation to the nutrition, immune, and trophic functions of human milk is the fact that nursing one's young actually extends the required period for maternal care. So animals that don't nurse their young, like, the young will just go off and swim away, and that's it. Like, they were inside their mother for some period of time, and then they're gone. But mammals who depend on their mother for their nourishment also have this very, very prolonged period of maternal care. And this aspect of maternal care has been really interesting to me recently, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. Okay, so how and why does breastfeeding benefit the baby's brain? So we hear a lot about what's in the milk. There is nutrition in the milk. There are a lot of other components to milk that are non-nutritional but are very important. And that's really interesting. There's great science. But I think it's important to remember that it's not only in the milk, right? There's a lot of maternal care that is going on in the act of breastfeeding. And so it's not really just about the actual fluid, the milk, but it's really the whole context around which mothers are nursing and caring for their infants that we need to think about. So what is in the milk that might be important for the developing brain in particular? We know that there are many unique nutrients in human milk. So there are fats and fatty acids. There are proteins and amino acids. There are carbohydrates, both nutritional and digestible carbohydrates, primarily lactose, as well as non-digestible carbohydrates, these oligosaccharides that are not digested by the baby, but in fact provide a rich source of nutrition for the bacteria that are colonizing the gut. And these nutrients we think of primarily as providing nutrition for the baby, but they actually, it turns out, have many immune functions as well. And so are important to consider. And then there are also a number of non-nutrient bioactive factors that are in milk, and that includes hormones, growth factors, enzymes, antibodies, and live cells. And all of these are likely to have some benefit to the baby. But again, on this theme, it's not just about the milk. Breastfeeding itself is related to many nurturing behaviors and many aspects of the mother-infant relationship. And there's been more research coming out on this topic that I just want to share briefly. So longer duration of breastfeeding is related to greater maternal sensitivity, a greater ability of the mother to perceive the needs of her infant and to respond to them. Breastfeeding is also related to stronger infant attachment security. So children who have been breastfed have a stronger sense of confidence and ability to separate from their mother and then turn back to their mother for reassurance when they need it. So attachment security. And mothers who breastfeed their babies do, on average, have more positive interactions with their infants in the course of feeding their babies. And all of these factors are known to go on to influence improved brain development. So even in the absence of differences in nutrition between formula and breast milk, there are differences in that mother-infant interaction and in the development of that interaction that occur and are just important to point out. Okay, so how do we study this stuff? So, scientists love to do experiments, and doing experiments is in some ways very satisfying. You can come up with a question, you can design a study, you can make an intervention, you can see what happens after that intervention. You can really dig into the biology with an experiment. The problem is, of course, the species specificity issue, right? So we can do lots of great experiments in animal models, but to what extent that tells us about humans is often very limited. There are also ethical issues with experiments. Obviously, we can't just randomly assign women in the United States to either breastfeed or not breastfeed their babies. That's just not something that we can go around doing. I don't think anyone would want to, but if you think as a scientist, how do I test these hypotheses that I have about beneficial effects of breastfeeding, and how are we going to actually answer those questions rigorously? This is a real issue. How do we do that without being able to rely on more traditional kinds of experiments? In terms of observational designs, so these are the kinds of studies that a lot of our speakers earlier today have cited. So these are studies where you observe patterns in breastfeeding, and then you observe patterns in the outcomes that you're interested in, and you look for relationships between those factors. And the big advantage, of course, is that you can do this kind of work in large human populations, which is the relevant population for us. And you can really dig into not just if there is a relationship, but to what extent does that relationship exist over the whole range of exposures that we see. If you were going to do an experiment, you usually typically only would be able to see a couple of different options for exposures, whereas if you're looking across the whole population, you can say anywhere from no breastfeeding to 5 years of breastfeeding if you have that kind of data. So it gives you a much wider range of exposure. The con is, of course, these unmeasured shared factors. So there may be factors that are related to longer duration of breastfeeding. They're also related to better child health outcomes, and it really has nothing to do with the breastfeeding. It's just those shared factors, and how do we account for those factors so that the research that we produce and publish and share and use to drive policy is as accurate as possible and not biased by these shared factors or confounders. And then, sorry, that's covered up a little bit. And then just ethical issues on this side. So we're not experimenting, but we are to some extent limited by the kinds of outcomes that we can measure, because we really can't get at, for example, certain tissues. It would be great to be able to look inside the brain to see what's happening in relation to breastfeeding, but we're pretty limited in our ability to do that, just for example, whereas in animal models, you have a much better ability to get into sort of a deep dive into the biology of different tissue effects. So these are the options that we have for studying the beneficial effects of breastfeeding on child health and some of the pros and cons. And I'm going to share some of our research and also some research from other groups that leverages these different study designs to give us different perspectives on the question of how breastfeeding affects infant brain development. Okay, so the question is, does breastfeeding have a beneficial impact on child neurodevelopment? And there are many, many studies on this topic, most but not all of which show that there is a relationship. This is data from a study that we did using data from a cohort called Project Viva. It's a pre-birth cohort that was established in the Boston area in the 1990s. The mothers were enrolled during pregnancy and studied for a number of pregnancy-related factors, primarily focused on nutrition. And now the children have continued to be followed actually through an early teen visit right now that's ongoing. But for this study, we used data from a mid-childhood visit, so somewhere around 7 years of age. And you can see here a pretty clear relationship between a verbal IQ score on the y-axis and the duration of any breastfeeding in months on the x-axis. So greater duration of breastfeeding, greater advantage in verbal IQ at school age. So that gives you kind of a snapshot of, is there a relationship? Yeah, there definitely looks like there is one. But the next question is, by how much does additional increments in breastfeeding benefit the child's brain development? And here we showed the data in a table, and you can see these numbers. For example, let's just see, I don't know if this is going to work, but if you look over at 7 years and then the row that says any, so for each additional month that the baby was breastfed, the IQ score was 0.4 points higher at age 7. And you can see that if you look down a row at exclusive breastfeeding, the benefit was double that, right? So for each additional month of any breastfeeding, there was a 0.4 point IQ advantage, whereas for each additional month of exclusive breastfeeding, the advantage was 0.8 points or twice as big. We did pay really careful attention to these shared factors, these potential confounders that might bias our result. And because the study was so rigorously designed from the outset, we had measures of things like maternal IQ, like maternal and paternal education level, like the developmental stimulation that was available in the home, that kind of thing. And we adjusted for all of those factors. And even taking all of that out of the equation, we still found this pretty significant beneficial effect. Okay, so I alluded to the fact earlier that, it would be awesome to do an experiment, but we can't really do that on people. And I was not telling you the whole truth. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Probit study, but this is a really interesting and very creative way to actually do an experiment on that question of breastfeeding and child health outcomes. And so this is a study that was done in the Republic of Belarus. It's called the Probit, or the Promotion of Breastfeeding Intervention Trial. And this is actually like a really nice example of a policy experiment. We've heard a lot about how hospital practices, maternity hospital practices, are important to set the stage for good breastfeeding outcomes in the population. So this study took advantage of the fact that there was very little breastfeeding going on in the Republic of Belarus at the outset of the study. They did what's called a cluster randomized trial, where they randomized not individual people, but actually maternity hospitals to engage in what we know of as the baby-friendly hospital initiative practices. And this trial was, or this intervention was very successful. So of the babies who were born in intervention hospitals at 3 months, 45% of them were exclusively breastfeeding versus the background rate of 6%. So this was a very successful intervention in a place that had very little breastfeeding at the outset. And by doing this very creatively, you're then able to look at the child health outcomes that were essentially randomized based on where the babies were born. And they looked at school age, at verbal IQ, and you can see here that whereas in babies who were born in the control hospitals, they had an IQ score of 99 on average, which is that's an average IQ for the population. The babies who were born in the hospitals that received the breastfeeding intervention had an IQ score of 109. And adjusting for various factors that are required because of the design of this study, they found an adjusted benefit of 7.5 IQ points, which is actually a really big effect size. And again, this is the closest that you're ever going to get to an experimental design where we're not going to be able to randomize individual people, but they were able to randomize hospitals and really show in a rigorous way that there was an advantage to the cognitive outcomes in the children based on a very specific policy intervention, which was providing optimal support for breastfeeding in the maternity hospital, and then subsequently. Okay, so what's going on in the brains? We don't have animal models to really answer this question, but there's been some really neat work going on in the MRI space that I just wanted to share with you. This is a paper that came out of Brown in 2013. They studied children anywhere from 10 months to 4 years, 10 months to 4 years. And they pretty rigorously established, although retrospectively with the mother, the extent to which the child had been breastfed. And then did MRI imaging that was specifically focused on white matter development in the brain. So this is an interesting aspect of infant brains. Babies come out with very little myelin in their brain, and the first year of life, there's a massive amount of development in the white matter. And they were able to see in this study increased white matter development in specific regions of the brain related to being breastfed versus formula fed. So really trying to get into the mechanism of what is happening with these breastfed children that's not happening with formula fed children. I will just point out one limitation, which is that, although these differences are definitely present, what explains these differences, what the actual mechanisms are, you can't really tell from this kind of study, but it just gets sort of one layer deeper beyond an IQ test and is able to show you a little bit of a window inside the baby's brain and some pretty significant differences. Okay, so that's sort of bigger picture, more research focused on general populations of infants, but what about the vulnerable preterm infant population? That's a population of babies that's near and dear to my heart because those are the babies that I take care of in my clinical practice, and a lot of my research has been focused on that population as well. So preterm birth is a big problem. Over 11% of babies in this country are born preterm, and about 75,000 babies per year are born very preterm. So those are the smallest and the highest risk babies. These babies remain in the hospital for many months after they're born. And so while that's a big challenge for families, it's also an opportunity for us as a healthcare system to intervene and to provide the most optimal care. And I've been in particular interested in nutritional care. The costs of preterm birth have been estimated at $26 billion per year. So this is a big problem, not just from a health perspective, but also from a cost perspective over the life course of these children. And what's different about preterm infants? What's so special? Why do we need to study them separately from the rest of the babies that we study? So first, preterm infants have very, very different nutrient requirements. In those first few months of life, you can see, looking at these babies side by side, the one on the left, the extremely preterm baby, is skinny and a lot smaller because that baby has missed out on the opportunity to have nutrients transferred from the mother during that third trimester, right? The baby spends the third trimester with us in the NICU rather than inside the mother's womb. And so there is a really big need for us to try to match as well as possible the nutrition that the baby would be receiving had the baby remained in utero. These babies have very immature immune systems, GI systems, and so they can't often tolerate the kinds of feedings that a full-term baby can tolerate. And then even when we are able to feed them, they often don't absorb nutrients as well. And so that's a big challenge in our practice. Babies frequently leave the NICU having lost weight relative to what their in utero growth trajectory should have been, reflecting relative undernutrition. And then there are these major, major differences in brain development that every time I look at this slide, I just find it shocking. So if you look to the left at that 28-week picture, you can see what a brain looks like of one of my patients. It's smooth. It doesn't have a lot of sort of lumps and bumps. And over the course of the 10 weeks at the end of gestation, the brain undergoes a tremendous amount of both growth, so increase in size, and then also development. You can see the cortical folding that is going on. And it's just an incredibly important time period for brain development. And then in terms of the immune system, we know these babies have a very underdeveloped immune system and are susceptible to infections that can compromise their immediate health and also have long-term impact. And then there's this key feeding difference that people don't really talk a lot about, but I think especially for an audience that doesn't spend a lot of time in the NICU, it's really important to point out that babies in the NICU don't actually breastfeed in the way that you probably think about breastfeeding, right? They are not able to actually suck on a bottle or a breast until about 34, 35 weeks gestation. So they're fed by a feeding tube like this baby on the right. And their interactions with the mother are challenging. These babies are sick, they're in isolates, they're in the hospital. The mothers can't often, and the fathers can't often spend as much time as they would like to with their babies. And so that's just a big difference to point out. So, one question is, for this particular population of sick babies, can human milk feeding compensate for that early separation from the placenta? These babies are spending their third trimester in our care. Is there something about human milk that could help ease that transition? So I showed this figure at the beginning where there's this kind of continuum between the functions of the placenta in amniotic fluid and then the functions of the mammary gland in terms of mother's milk. For a preterm baby, they're born early and that transition happens earlier. And so, one really interesting question is to what extent ingestion of nutrients, of growth factors, of hormones in the maternal milk could, to some extent, replace what they're not swallowing in terms of amniotic fluid had they remained in utero. And it turns out that from a clinical perspective, there are a number of benefits of human milk feeding for hospitalized, very low birth weight infants. The presence of immune factors in human milk provides protection against infections. The presence of trophic factors in milk is likely responsible for the improvement in GI maturity that we see. And then what I've been really interested in is the extent to which nutrients in human milk and potentially even non-nutrient factors improve brain development. This is a study that we did in collaboration with a group of investigators in Australia. This is an existing longitudinal cohort study of very preterm infants who were born in the late 90s. And in Australia, they do this unbelievable job of keeping track of every baby from the beginning to the end of the study. So this is a study of 180 babies, and there's over 95% follow-up all the way to school age. So I think we have a lot to learn from our Australian colleagues in that respect. But it also provides a great opportunity to really try to understand what some of the influences are from the neonatal intensive care unit on long-term cognitive development. And one of the advantages that we had in this study was that we were able to look at not just the typical measures that are used in preterm infants, which are usually toddler assessments like the Bailey scales, but we actually were able to look at IQ at school age, as well as some more academic achievement tests like reading and math, and then other tests of cognitive function, including attention, working memory, and language. And you can see in the bold where greater human milk intake in the NICU was associated with better outcomes on these measures. And remember, again, these are not babies that are breastfeeding. These are babies who are being fed their mother's milk through a tube. And so it's really a dose effect. So for each additional day that a baby got more than 50% of their mother's milk rather than formula, the scores on these tests were higher: IQ, math, working memory, and then also motor function. And we were able to adjust for a number of potential confounding factors, including the baby's age, sex, gestational age, how sick they were in the NICU, and also social risk score. And I just want to pause to say, we do a lot of things in the NICU to try to improve the baby's health, their development. If you multiply that incremental effect over the full feeding volume that a baby receives, that's 7.5-point advantage. That's a really, really big number. We don't, I think, have any other interventions in neonatal intensive care that have that big of an impact on brain development. So just to kind of pause for a minute and say, that's not just an if, that's a how much, and the how much is a lot. And so we were curious, again, what's going on inside the brain. And this study in particular had the advantage of being run by people who really have led the field in MRI work, including my now boss, Dr. Terry Inder. And they incorporated MRI imaging in the design of this study, both at term equivalent age, so when the babies were leaving the NICU, and then also at school age, and somehow managed to get 180 babies through an MRI scanner before they went home from the hospital. And I am ever grateful for those efforts, because then we got to use their data. And we looked at, and then what we do with the MRI images is, so you're used to looking from a clinical perspective for injury, for stroke, that kind of thing. But there are also ways, so that's like qualitative, but there are also ways to quantify data from the MRI. And in this case, we used special software that's designed to take these cross-sectional images and actually calculate the volume of the brain. So, the kind of quick and dirty way to think about how a baby's brain is growing is to measure their head circumference. But with this technique, we're able to actually assess the size of the baby's brain in three-dimensional space. And then not just the total brain, but also the segments of the brain. And we found that, in particular, greater human milk intake was associated with a larger volume of the deep nuclear gray matter. And that's a part of the brain that's a major relay station for cognitive processing. So again, it doesn't really get at what is mechanistically impacting these effects, but it just gets one layer deeper than a cognitive test to say, yes, there are differences in the brain that we can see that are related to the dose of human milk that a baby received in the NICU. Okay, so I showed you an observational study. Now I'm going to show you another kind of creative experiment. So as I'm sure you can imagine, these mothers that we work with are really challenged to produce enough milk for their babies. They're challenged both from biological perspectives, delivering very early, having their own health issues, and then from the same kinds of structural challenges that our other mothers face in terms of needing to go back to work, needing to care for other children at home, that kind of thing. So what do we do when mother's own milk is in short supply? So we could give formula, but we also have another option, which is to give milk that's been donated by other mothers and then pasteurized. And that milk is available from many different community milk banks. And so an interesting set of studies are now coming out, and I'm just going to share one of them, which is called the Domino study. And in this study, they randomized babies to get either donor milk or preterm formula when their own mother's milk was in short supply. Either the mother couldn't pump or the mother pumped but couldn't make enough milk to meet the baby's needs. They either gave the baby donor milk or formula. They did find some interesting beneficial effects of donor milk on, in particular, necrotizing enterocolitis was reduced in the babies who got donor milk. But interestingly, they designed the study to detect a difference in neurodevelopment at 2 years, and they found no difference. And if anything, there was a trend towards slightly worse outcomes in the babies who got the donor milk. So that was a really interesting finding in a very well-designed and well-conducted study that was specifically aimed at looking at neurodevelopmental outcomes. So my question back to this issue of maternal care is, does maternal care partly explain the beneficial effects that we see of human milk intake in the NICU? Are the mothers who are providing more milk also the mothers who are providing more skin to skin? Are they also the mothers who are just more engaged with their babies, not just in the NICU, but after they go home? We don't have an answer to that yet, but I think it's an important question for us to ask ourselves. Is it just the milk, or is it the milk plus the mother that matters? Because this has very big implications for the policy work that everyone here is doing. Do we spend all of our policy dollars on breast pumps and pumping rooms, or do we also need to do something to enable mothers to actually spend more time with their with their babies who are in the hospital for months and months at a time? So just put some thoughts together. I think there are interesting evolutionary contexts to think about, but there's also a modern day context that involves there being not just nutrient and non-nutrient bioactive factors in the milk, but there's also this aspect of maternal care that is still important. We know from our research and from several other studies that longer duration and more exclusive breastfeeding is associated with better cognitive outcomes in children, and that these effects are seen not just in early infancy, but also into school age and beyond. And that the benefits of human milk for preterm infants in particular are large and accompanied by structural changes in the brain. And then I think we just need to really try to understand better what the mechanisms are, to what extent is this explained by nutritional factors, and to what extent is this explained by maternal care mechanisms. So bottom line, all babies need nourishment and nurturing for optimal brain development. And thank you for your attention. Be happy to take any questions.
For such an interesting talk. I have a question about the donor milk. Obviously, in other parts of the world, there is the wet nurse concept where it's just one individual. And how do you feel that I would imagine that it's not just one donor, but multiple donors, and how that might impact the outcomes of the study, because one donor may minimize the potential in terms of whether there are any antibodies that develop versus, multiple donors.
Right. No, that's a great question. So I think first and foremost, from the perspective of many different health outcomes in preterm infants, we know that babies getting their own mother's milk is always going to be favorable to getting donor milk. The pragmatic question, though, is what to do in the case where the mother is doing everything she can and we're doing everything we can to support her and there's still a shortfall. And then the question is donor milk preferable to formula or not? So, you know, I'm certainly not a milk banking expert. My understanding is that milk is pooled, and that to some extent can reduce the variation that you see from batch to batch, but there's still going to be quite a bit of variation. I know there are some milk banks that will particularly set aside preterm milk for preterm babies. So there's some attempt at addressing those issues, but, you know, to the extent that we can get babies their own mother's milk, that's always going to be the best option. It's just that from a very pragmatic standpoint, we at the clinical front lines need to do something when the mother doesn't bring enough milk in that day. And so that kind of study is really, really aimed at helping to inform that pragmatic decision.
I have two questions. The first is related, actually. Could the pasteurization process be what impacts the outcome on the milk bank milk on the baby?
So pasteurization changes many, but not all beneficial components of human milk. It certainly could explain why mother's own milk provides more protection than donor milk.
The second question is related to women, particularly marginalized women who live in chronic stress, toxic stress even, have elevated cortisol levels. Does that impact the brain development outcomes of their children in terms of what they may extend to the breast milk and through breastfeeding?
So does cortisol transmitted through breast milk and ingested by the infants mediate the adverse effects of stress on the baby? That's a great question. I think I've seen some research on cortisol in breast milk, but probably not enough to really answer that question. I think that would be a very interesting mechanism. We definitely know that hormones are in milk and they probably do impact the baby to some extent, but I don't know. That's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your very important and interesting research. And I'm especially interested in the idea that it's not just the milk, that there are other factors. Other factors that I've heard about that I'm wondering what your opinion are about, first of all, the microbiome, the recent research that some of the microbiome is in the milk, but some of it's on the areola, and some other external factors. Just also the sucking at the bottle versus sucking at the breast and how that might, be better for the baby to be directly at the breast.
Right, so I'll take your second question first. So remember that these babies, for the most part, during their NICU stay, are not sucking to primarily nourish themselves. They may suck on a pacifier for practice, but most of their actual nourishment is coming from a feeding tube just due to their developmental challenges. In terms of the microbiome, there's unbelievably interesting research going on right now. I mean, so one possibility, for example, is that having more favorable bacteria in the gut might enhance digestion and therefore improve the nutrition that the baby can extract from their milk. Those are hypotheses that need to be tested. And then the next step after that would be potentially to design interventions that could improve the microbiome as a way to get at better nutrition. I mean, those are very hot topics right now, but we don't have the answers yet.
Excellent presentation. I just want to expand on a couple of the comments. One, I think the issue of mature milk versus preterm milk is going to be the hot issue. Clearly, the neurotrophic benefits of preterm milk are different and better and more so than donor milk that comes from mothers who are 6 months postpartum, it's not so much the pooling. If we add on the processing issues of pasteurization, freezing, thawing, further causes deterioration of the quality of the milk. But I think the key, when I look at the microRNA and the stem cells, which I will find in preterm milk, you don't find the same quantity in milk from donors who are 6 months postpartum, and that might be the more of the critical factor. Secondly, in terms of the interaction and the reciprocal relationship between the mother and infant, there are ways, even when infants are not nursing, called kangaroo care, which could compensate for all, or at least a major part of that positive benefit. So I think this has to be put into the equation too. There are ways of
Yeah.
simulating.
Absolutely, and forgive me if I didn't make this clear, but one of the points that I just want to make is, we see this very large benefit that we attribute purely to the milk, but whether some of that benefit is actually explained by greater interaction, which itself is related to providing more breast milk. I mean, it's complicated, but we know that, for example, kangaroo care or skin-to-skin care enhances the mother's ability to provide breast milk. So it's a little bit tangled, but I just, wanted to just make the point that these factors are related to each other, but they also may be exerting independent effects as well. So yeah, thank you for your comments.
Hi, Lucy Sullivan, Thousand Days. I'm familiar a little bit with Sean Dionne's work. I haven't read the paper, but I did watch a talk that he actually gave at a Nestle meeting. That he shared research that showed exclusively breastfed babies and compared that to exclusively formula-fed babies and 3 different brands of formula. Didn't list those brands at 3 months, and just the huge variation in terms of brain development. Which I thought was fascinating. I'm not sure if it's a published paper or not. But basically, formula companies spend a lot of time and money making claims about their products. So taking that in reverse, the claims that we are able to make about breastfeeding, and it's both the milk and the mother, would you say that we're not talking about preterm infants, but full-term infants, is it 7.5? Would you use the probit number in terms of a potential increase in IQ?
I mean, I think probit is probably the most rigorous study on the topic in terms of its design. The disadvantage is that it was conducted in the Republic of Belarus, so the extent to which you can generalize those results to the U.S., I'm not sure, but I think that's a very legitimate study to quote because it's very large and it's very well designed. I will say that in the interest of being totally transparent about the data, my understanding is that there was some knowledge on the part of the people who were assessing the child's development, which hospital setting that child was born into, and they are funded to use computer-assisted assessment for a subsequent follow-up, which would take away that potential bias. So I would keep an eye out for that publication because that'll be really, really interesting. And if they continue to show a persistent effect, I think that would be very, very strong evidence in favor of breastfeeding effects on IQ and a useful estimate, a useful number. Yeah, but I think that's the best we have now.
Thank you.
Mine is just a very brief comment that despite the fact that pasteurization degrades some of the things in breast milk, we know that donor milk still prevents against necrotizing enterocolitis.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the morbidities associated with NEC is one of the things that keeps the baby in the hospital and eventually leads to impaired neurodevelopmental outcomes.
Absolutely. NEC itself is associated with poor developmental outcomes. So it was interesting that the Domino study didn't see a difference in neurodevelopment, and probably in this, I wouldn't say this is a problem for the babies, but a problem for the researchers is that in general, the mothers in that study were able to provide a lot of their own milk, and so the dose of anything other than the own mother's milk was relatively small. But absolutely, and I was focused on brain development, but I think one of the most important findings from that Domino study was that using donor milk instead of formula did reduce the risk of NEC in that very well-designed study. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you. Just a quick question. It was a great presentation with a lot of really important information. I had a question about the probit study, and it's been a long time since I've looked at it. But this is the study where the random assignment was by hospital.
By hospital.
practice. And didn't all babies in the probit study start breastfeeding?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay.
So anyone could breastfeed, anyone. It was really based on maternal choice primarily, but the difference is that half of the hospitals were randomized to implement essentially baby friendly, and the other hospitals were just left to their own devices. And so the way the study was designed and the way it worked out was that the babies who were born in the baby-friendly hospitals had a much higher rate of exclusive breastfeeding than the babies who were born in the routine care hospitals.
Okay. It might be a specific study that I looked at where they were looking among those who all started in the trial, and then the outcomes they were looking at were exclusivity and duration.
They have
But I thought
published
they
a
had all
number
initiated.
of studies
Might have
looking
been
at their
separate.
data observationally, so not by intervention, but across their whole
Okay,
population.
so I was wondering if in the outcomes that you were showing, whether there were babies who never breastfed, and there were.
Absolutely, in both groups.
In both
It's just, we just look at the results by baby-friendly or not,
Right.
but knowing that the infants born in the baby-friendly hospitals were much more likely to have breastfed. Yeah. All right, thank you.